name is Mike Tierney. I'm here representing the College of William & Mary and one of the projects there, Aid Data, which I think was introduced earlier as a research lab at the college. Aid Data seeks to make development finance more accessible and more actionable by lots of different groups. I'm mostly interested in researchers, but you can see how some of this data could be useful to policymakers, journalists, or others as well. We study research on aid allocation and the causes and effects of aid and other kinds of development finance. Today I'm going to talk about one particular project, the Tracking Underreported Financial Flows project, that uses open sources in order to track the development finance flows from countries that don't report their aid to international bodies. This is a second best solution for those of us who are interested in studying the causes and effects of aid. It is not optimal, and I'll close my remarks today by asking for official development finance statistics from China, which will put me out of business, but will make it easier and better to do good research on aid. So, like Richard, I had planned to speak a little bit longer, but I'm a professor. What are you going to do? But instead what I'll do is go through 10 slides in now 9 minutes and make a bunch of provocative comments. If you're interested in following up, why am I saying what I'm saying? How do I think I know what I'm saying I know? I would say read the paper and or follow up in Q&A. So, first things first, TOUGH is open source methodology that looks at lots of different sources to try to get a sense of what, in this case, the Chinese government is spending in Africa on development. We've been at this for about 45 plus months. We have almost 10,000 different information sources that feed into the data set. It's a project level data set. So each individual financial flow or project has a row in the database. It currently tracks over 27,000 Chinese development finance projects, and as of 2014, we're at about 98 billion US dollars. This fall in 2016, we will also publish publicly project-level data sets on China in Latin America and in Asia using the same method. That was by the way, that was my former student, Austin Strange, doing ground truthing of our data in South Africa. Okay. How has data sourcing changed over time? Many of you likely saw the original data set that came out. As with any scientific data collection problem, there were problems with the data because this was not official data. This was us using mostly media reports to try to understand what the Chinese were financing in Africa. And you can see the big blue bar, almost 90% of our rows in our database were sourced from media sources in the first iteration. In the second iteration, this went down to about 68, and now we're at about 54% of all the sources are media sources. The other sources, as you can see, are government documents. So once you go public, lots of things happen. People who know a lot more than you do about what China's doing in Africa come forward, and they say, hey, wait a minute, I think you got this wrong. Or wait a minute, here's a source that shows you that particular project was suspended. Or here's an official document from the Chinese government. Right? So whether it's from an embassy website or whether it's from MOFCOM, the number of sources from official sources linking to the projects has gone up. You can see the others there. Okay, so the provocative thing that I was going to do to keep you awake here in the afternoon was to make 10 claims, things we think we know about Chinese development finance, and talk about them in terms of the conventional wisdom, and then see whether or not the conventional wisdom is accurate or inaccurate. It was perfect to come after Richard. I didn't hear anything in particular that I disagreed with, and Richard certainly knows a lot more about what's going on now and what's going to happen in the future than I do. So I'm taking you back about 15 years, right? So our data set covers the years 2000 to 2014. So one of the claims that I've been reading a lot lately, in fact, the thing that inspired this paper was a newspaper article I read in late March, which said, how did China become the largest provider of aid to Africa? And I thought, wow, I didn't know that was true. And so did some digging, and I guess it really depends on what you're counting. So I think China is not the largest donor in Africa today, nor has it been over the last 15 years. But I think there are two reasons why people might think that. One is they're conflating something that's like ODA with other forms of official finance. And the other forms of official finance, or just foreign direct investment that's private, is much more visible. And so people see this large footprint of China in Africa, and they infer that this is aid. and it's not always aid. So the orange bar at the bottom here represents Chinese ODA-like flows that we could track using open sources from 2000 to 2013. So whether you're the World Bank, just IDA, or whether you're the US over this time period, those are larger donors. However, when you count other official flows, or flows that we can't tell whether they're aid or other official flows, they're not for development necessarily, China is almost as large over this time period as the United States. It's basically indistinguishable. And if you look at this visual on the right-hand side, this shows change over time since the financial crisis. And what should be striking to you is a 400% increase for one donor and a decrease for the United States. And I think that's typical of other traditional donors. They've gone down since the financial crisis. Okay. Second, Chinese aid focuses exclusively on the hardware of development. Okay. Half-truth. First, if you look at the top 5 sectors of funding using our database by dollar amount, then it looks like, yes, in fact, when you look at aid plus other official flows from China, there's an awful lot of infrastructure spending going on here. So that looks right. However, 2 caveats. Thing one, China does, if you just count projects, if you count the number of interactions, and you look at smaller grant type projects, which are often not as well covered in the media, what you see is a very different looking pie over there that does not look like it's sectorally focused exclusively on infrastructure. Second, when we did ground truthing of our own data set to go in to African countries to look to see whether or not on the ground were these projects implemented or were they canceled, one of the things we found out was not just sort of what errors we had in the data set, but also what was missing. And so what's missing, and this may not surprise you, are smaller and technical assistance projects. If we had a guy from the Ministry of Health contact us and say, hey, you're missing a lot of our medical teams. Like, I was in charge of these medical teams. We sent 4 people for a month and a half to Tanzania to do cataract surgery, and that's not in your data set. Here, let me show you an article I published, which is now a source, right? So those are harder to see from in media, and they're harder to see from the sky if you're using satellites. And you have to have other sources of information, which I think we're getting as we engage with more people who know a lot more about what's going on in China, but also people who know a lot more about what's going on in Africa. Chinese aid is used to advance foreign policy interests. True, duh. So for maybe economists or people who do development studies are either surprised or appalled by this, I don't know. But as a political scientist, this seems very normal to me. So there's multiple measures we could look at here, but 2 very rough and ready measures would be, does China give ODA-like assistance to countries that do not recognize it diplomatically? And the answer is no. So over the course of our time period in Africa, there were 4 countries out of 53 that did not recognize the PRC, and during those time periods, they did not get any ODA-like flows. They got very small numbers of OOF, of loans, not at a concessional rate, but not much. The second way to measure this, and this is what most political science do, who study international political economy, is to look at voting in the United Nations General Assembly. So this is how we study US aid allocation, French aid allocation, and now Chinese aid allocation. And it turns out, if you vote with China more frequently in the UN General Assembly, you are much more likely to get ODA. Yeah, again, so I didn't know the room was full of political scientists. So this is a graphic that just shows the actual amount, the blue bar, and then the range of what you would get, the estimated range about how much money you would get by year if you voted at the top end, which is Egypt, or at the bottom end, which is Equatorial Guinea, right? So these are estimates. I got 2 minutes, awesome. China is a rogue donor, all right? So we heard this over and over, and I think an increasing number of people who are studying this are sort of making this more conditional and questioning it. So I think the best paper that's been written on this is by 2 development economists in Germany, Fuchs and Dreher, they put together 6 different data sets since the 1950s to show that the 2 main claims about China being a rogue donor is China targets autocratic governments in Africa. They give more money to autocratic governments, and they give more money to countries that have lots of natural resources. Okay, in terms of ODA-like flows, false on both cases. In terms of OOF, false on the autocratic, right? So OOF, there is more money going from Chinese OOF to countries that are rich in natural resources. But the take-home message for me on China as a rogue donor is the more we look at how China allocates its aid, the more it looks like other great powers. Chinese aid causes conflict, okay? So this depends on how you measure conflict. Really briefly, a famous paper in the conflict literature says that aid shocks cause civil wars to occur in developing countries. That means when when donors pull their aid out of a country, the probability of civil war goes up. So it's well established empirically. We reran this same exact analysis by including Chinese aid, and we replicate it perfectly except in the countries where China is present. So where China's giving a lot of money or where they substitute aid, the probability of civil war goes back down, right? This is a broader point. The broader point is if you're making claims about how aid influences growth or aid influences conflict or anything else, whatever your dependent variable is, you should not leave out non-DAC donors, especially the largest non-DAC donor, which is China. Others have found that allocating aid to developing governments, Chinese aid to governments, causes those governments to crack down more on civil society. That might actually be a mechanism to explain the previous finding. So they don't allocate to rogue countries, but they might in some ways create, they may help cause governments to have the capacity to crack down on their political opponents. Since I'm down to 1 minute, I will skip economic growth and just say you should look at subnational data, geocoded, to study economic growth, not cross-national time series data. So you can do that with our data, you should do that. Chinese aid is unpopular with Chinese citizens. So when we launched our data set, huge amount of discourse on Chinese social media, and citizens had two very different reactions. They were both very proud that their government was so generous in helping people in Africa, but they were also upset. They said, we're a developing country ourselves. We have our own problems. So this caused me, just in the last month, to look for public opinion surveys on this question in China, and I can't find very many. I can only find 2 done in the last 10 years. So if someone knows of a better data source, or if someone wants to do a survey with me, I would love to study Chinese public opinion and aid. Last slide. Okay, China's not a transparent donor. Other people in this room have written on this. Happy to talk about that in the Q&A if you want. Conclusions. Be careful to compare apples to apples. So our job was to crosswalk Chinese aid with ODA-like definitions. And now I hear that we're going to change all our definitions. So we'll have to do some more crosswalking when the real world gets around to that. But we can learn a lot from open source data, but we would learn a lot more if China would publish official data at the project level that's very granular. We would learn a lot more about the causes and consequences of Chinese aid if we could do that. Thanks very much.